it's my great pleasure today to not be speaking. So Ruben Granado, the head of our Social Action Committee, is going to introduce our speaker.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. My name is Ruben Granado. I am co-chair along with Marilyn Robbins, and we are co-chairs of Social Action. We have a special guest today, and before I go further, just to remind everybody, we're going to have a blood drive out in the parking lot tomorrow. So, our guest speaker is Dr. I almost said Jaime, but Dr. Jamie Krowlessar. He is a native of New York and a transplant here to Texas. And Dr. Krowlessar has seen and experienced a range of injustices. He is a voice for the communities he serves. He is a student of people and scriptures. Dr. Krowlessar has a very impressive education here. He has an undergraduate degree in theology from Atlantic Union College. He has a master's of divinity from Andrews University. He has a doctorate of ministry degree from the United Theological Seminary. He is currently working on his PhD in public policy and social change. Dr. Krowlessar works with the clergy table for Faith in Texas, which some of us worked with Faith in Texas about 5-6 years ago. He works with an array of different faiths to help fight against injustice. Dr. Krowlessar's thoughts can be read in the Dallas Morning News in the op-ed section. He is author of a few books. One of them is called Justice or Just Us, Sermons and Reflections on the Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness, and how to put the neighbor back in the hood. Dr. Krowlessar is married and has 2 children. And
Here with us today.
Dr. Krowlessar.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
I'm grateful to be here and honored to stand in this wonderful, wonderful space with all of you wonderful individuals. I had the privilege and the honor of meeting your rabbi about 3 or 4 years ago through Faith in Texas, and we continue to fight for justice. And I am absolutely just enamored and amazed by your giftedness, the way that you allow God to use you, and the way that you are leading this congregation. It should never be taken lightly, so I do appreciate you and glad to be here today. When the email came to me from Ruben, and I communicated with Rabbi Zelony, and I asked her, how long should I speak? And she told me about 10 to 15 minutes. So when I read that, I said, that's absurd. There's no way you can speak for 10 to 15 minutes. In my faith tradition, the sermon has to be at least 40 minutes. But when I sat here, I totally understand why. It should be 10 to 15 minutes. So I prepared, being a good student, a good listener, prepared to speak for only 10 to 15 minutes. Now, I graduated from Andrews University, and I have to be honest with you, I learned Hebrew while I was there, but I only learned it to pass the class. As soon as I passed the class, I decided in my brain that I would become a Google scholar. So I credit myself as a Google scholar, so if there's anything that I need to look up or translate, I go right to Google. So if anybody is looking to enroll in the School of Google, you should see me. I can tell you how to get a degree to be the most proficient Google searcher there is. And then I could also add on a degree of Wikipedia if you like that as well. But nevertheless, I'm here for a purpose and a reason. And I'm here to highlight and to speak about on this weekend, Dr. Martin Luther King. And from the readings that we did this morning, there was one particular passage that stood out to me that I would like to share with you as well once again. And it's found in Exodus chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. And I'll read and you'll be hearing. It says, "During the long period, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. And their cry of help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them." If I could put a title on my discussion or my talk today, I want to talk about the power of our groans. The power of our groans. The Torah informs us that the king of Egypt has died and that a new regime has taken over. This new administration did not choose to follow the policies and procedures of the previous administration. Instead, they chose to reverse all the good that was done by Joseph and others. But instead, this administration decides to engage in an act of immense violence. Threatened by the growth of Israel, the king of Egypt thought it would be a good idea to send Shiphrah and Puah to kill the midwives, to kill all the boys. And to their surprise, the women went back to Pharaoh and said that the Hebrew women are too strong, or as the Bible would say, too vigorous. Frustrated by this, the king of Egypt decides that it must be right to kill all the boys and to drown them in the Nile. And I want you to know, Beth Torah, that the more things change, the more they stay the same. That there are still decrees going forth with the same ideology. Except we don't call them decrees, they are policies. But the outcome is still the same. Mass incarceration, unaffordable housing, school to prison pipelines, false narratives about migrants entering America, anti-Semitism. Synagogues have become target practice for innocent people exercising their right to worship God. And all of these evils have increased acts of violence towards marginalized groups. And just like Moses was drawn out of the Nile River to do the great work of standing up and going toe-to-toe with Pharaoh, God also called Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to go toe-to-toe with the pharaohs of today. The pharaoh of racism, the pharaoh of inequality, the pharaoh of injustice. And like Moses, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. declared to Pharaoh of his era that it's time that you let my people go. The passage of scripture that we read today is three very important facts that I would like for us to pay attention to. The Bible says that they groaned and they cried out for help. May I suggest to all of us that are here today that there is power in our groans and our cries. That would you believe it if I told you that when you weep, there is a strength that comes from above that will lift you up from any situation. Because to lament is the language of God. Lament in the Bible is a liturgical response to the reality of sufferings that engages God in the context of pain and trouble. The hope of lament is that God would respond to human suffering that is wholeheartedly communicated when we weep. And oftentimes we don't like to weep because we look at weeping or crying as a sign of weakness. But I know and understand that when we weep and cry out to God, God somehow moves towards us the same way he moved towards the children of Israel. And we can see from our reading, number 2, that because they groaned and they cried out, God heard. Isn't it reassuring to know that God hears us when we cry? That black people in America have been crying since the day that the first boat arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, over 400 years ago. His children have been crying since they were subjected to torture and torment in Auschwitz and all throughout the different places where we have seen victimization and violence towards groups of people. But I beg you, Congregation Beth Torah, that we must continue to weep because God hears. We must weep for the victims of mass incarceration. Weep for the children who go to sleep hungry. Weep for the victims of abuse. Weep for the mothers who have lost their sons and daughters to state-sanctioned police. Weep for those that are not treated fairly. Weep for our country. Weep for injustice to end and God's justice to begin. Number 3, God remembered. And I'm so glad that we serve a God that remembers. He does not forget the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I don't know about you, but I love the fact that the Bible always says Jacob. Because when I think about Jacob, I think about myself. That God is not only the God of Abraham, he's not only the God of Isaac, but he's the God of Jacob, who we understand was a deceiver and held his brother's heel and did all sorts of different things. So that just tells me that God is also the God of me, the God of the imperfect, the God of somebody like me who messes up sometimes. But he says that I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And one thing that is reassuring is that our God is a promise keeper, that he does not pleasure in human suffering. And I love how the scholar Abraham Joshua Heschel says, justice is not an ancient custom, a human convention, a value, but a transcendent demand freighted with divine concern. It is not only a relationship between man and man, it is an act involving God, a divine need. Justice in his line, righteousness his plummet. It is not on one ways, but in all his ways. It is validity, is not only universal, but also eternal, independent of will and experience. God's concern for justice grows out of his compassion for mankind. Martin Luther King Jr. said, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one affects us all indirectly. As a people of faith, we are not called to be bystanders, but our faith informs us to be upstanders. And that means that we don't stand on the sidelines and wait for things to happen. We stand up for the weak, the marginalized, the poor, and the oppressed. As I would say, the least, the lost, and the forgotten. And even though this weekend, our city will take the day off, on TV we will see images and hear this great speech of Dr. Martin Luther King. But it's one thing to take the day off and to play his videos over and over. But I encourage us to live out his words, to act upon what he said, to follow what God says in his words, and so that we may be able to see justice in our lifetime. And last but not least, because they cried, God heard, God remembered, and God knew it was time to act. There's a story about Denzel Washington. And Denzel Washington was being interviewed by a young man. And in this interview, the young man kept asking him, he said, what was your best role? Denzel Washington would look back at the young man. He said, my next role will be my best role. And so the young man looked at him again. He said, I'm sorry, I think you may have misunderstood the question. Out of all the wonderful movies, all the things that you have done, what would you say is your best role? Denzel looked at him and said, my next role is my best role. Frustrated, the young man asked him the question one more time. He says, what is your best role? And started naming some of the movies as if Denzel didn't know what movies he had already done. Naming all the movies, Denzel stopped and answered him. He said, you have not seen my best role as yet. As a matter of fact, what I'm going to do next is better than what I have done before. And I say this story to say that we have not seen the best of God as yet. That what we read in the Bible is amazing, and that we know that we see that God is a God who can part waters, who can speak and things exist. But if you trust and hold on and pray to God, I believe that his next role, his next move will be his best move. And so friends, family, brothers and sisters, I feel like I'm part of you, a part of this congregation. I said, next time I come back, I'm going to have a Yankee kippah to wear on my head. But let us trust and believe that justice must prevail, that justice will win, and that we can do this together. As I take my seat, I love to share stories. There was a young man getting on an elevator, and he saw another man running for it. And as the doors were closing, he asked his father, Dad, can I hold the doors open for that man? And the father said, obviously, yes, you can. And holding the doors open, the man ran and got on the elevator. When he got on the elevator, he said, why did you hold the door open for me? That's dangerous. The little boy looked at the man and said, since we were going to the top, I figured I might as well take somebody else with me. We are called to hold the elevator doors open and to use our power to keep them open, because if we're going to the top, let's take a few people with us. Thank you, Congregation Beth Torah.
So, Dr. Krowlessar, what we say when someone has done a good job in the sanctuary, we say, Yasher Koach, which means straight is your power. It's how you say, well done. So, Yasher Koach.